everyone. And welcome to our IMH webinar, lunchtime webinar. Today our webinar will have two presenters, and they will be talk about the research into experience of eating disorders and recovery. So the first speaker will be Jwana Aziz, who has recently completed her Ph.D. in communications at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And her work focuses on the implications of social media use on body images concerned among adolescent males. In this presentation today, she will focus on vigorexia among the wider spectrum of male mental health in terms of social, political, and economic changes, as well as the possible influences of social media. So now, Jwana, she will start with her presentation. Just before starting, sorry that I forgot, so there will be two presentations. So then it will be 20 minutes each of their presentations. So first we'll start Jwana, and this will be followed by the presentation of Rosie Pendrous, another 20 minutes. And so we will leave all the questions for the end. So we will have at the end 20 minutes for the Q&A. And I will appreciate if each of you can write your questions in the Q&A section within the webinar, and then I will be sharing those questions and indicate to who of the speakers you want to address the question. So thank you very much to both of you, Jwana and Rosie, for being here with us today. And so Jwana, now is your turn for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just open the screen share. One second. Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. Happy to be joining in with Rosie. As the title suggests, my presentation will focus on bigorexia and the wider scope of male mental health. When I was doing my PhD, I originally wanted to investigate the influence of social media use on body image in both adolescent females and males. But the more that I did research, the more that I recognized two things. Sorry, again. Okay, there we go. The more that I recognize two things. Number one, there are reports coming in from around the world detailing this epidemic of male-oriented eating disorders. And number two, there's a considerable disparity in research and literature when compared to the female demographic. Let's take the story here, published on The Guardian, of 13-year-old Charlie from the UK. Charlie was going through a hard time in school. He was being skinny shamed, bullied, and pushed around by other kids. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Because Charlie is too young to enroll in the gym, he developed his own workout routine. He would wake up every day at 4 a.m., have 5 eggs and 4 pieces of toast, and then proceeds to have a fire rapid workout of push-ups, pull-ups, and sit-ups. He would stop to have another meal and then proceed for a second workout in his room. Charlie said he would work out so extensively that he would often find it hard to breathe and would routinely get headaches. But to Charlie, it seems like his problems were solved. He was becoming more popular in school, getting attention from both girls and boys who wanted to be just like him. In fact, he started a trend in school where other boys started working out. But behind this pattern of overeating and exercising could be recognized as a form of disordered eating. Now, when we think of the term eating disorder, the first image that conjures up typically is that of an adolescent to young adult Caucasian woman, often pertaining to an affluent background. And it's really this stereotype that's holding us back from recognizing the various manifestations of eating disorders. In its early discourse, it was suggested that males do not get afflicted with eating disorders. That's because one of the traditional markers is amenorrhea, a marker that cannot be diagnosed onto male bodies. In fact, the history of eating disorders is categorized by a conspicuous absence of male patients, and any representation was considered rare and atypical. This has led to several things. Number one, the disparity in research and literature investigating eating disorders among male patients in both clinical and non-clinical settings. Number two, the inability to identify symptoms and consequently implement effective recovery programs. And number three, the stigmatization of males from seeking help. Currently, there's less than 1% of peer-reviewed scientific journals that include research on males with eating disorders. And only 3% of studies published in prominent body journal magazines discuss prevention techniques among men. Harvard professor Brian Austin points to an unethical nature in these male body image programs, which directs the blame onto male individuals as opposed to the socio-cultural environment. And so today, young males have internalized this message and consider body image or preoccupation with appearance to be a feminine or gay issue, and that they're somehow immune to this. And so what we recognize here is this relational dissonance coming from the medical field and the research field, as well as from male individuals themselves. So how does a male-oriented eating disorder look like? What is vigorexia? Vigorexia, also known as muscle dysmorphia, is a subtype of body dysmorphic disorders. It involves certain biological, psychological, and environmental factors, and describes a sustained pursuit towards muscularity. So typically, the individual believes that they are insufficiently muscular, and then those feelings of dissatisfaction are remedied by a drive towards muscularity. As we saw before, it includes the overconsumption of calories, known as caloric surplus or bulking, extensive exercise in order to transform the calories consumed into muscle mass. But the most indicative factor is the maladaptive use of performance-enhancing substances, such as steroids. While understanding the main drivers behind this ED is still in its primitive stages, scholars have been able to associate it with other mental conditions, such as proneness to anxiety and depression, traumatic incidents, and a history of bullying and victimization, as we saw previously with the story of Charlie. It's also been associated with masculinity constructs. For example, there was correlation between a drive for muscularity and conformity to masculine gender norms. The logic follows that a perceived deficit in a person's selfhood can be reconstructed through the proximity that the symbolic social power that masculinity has. And so the physical body becomes a vehicle for that access. A drive for muscularity has also been linked with holding conservative political views, such as opposing the redistribution of wealth and ultranationalism. So what we're observing here is that this form of eating disorder is not explicitly related to weight gain or degrees of muscularity, but in fact has connections with wider social constructs. And with that in mind, I'd like to move and talk about the story of the male body. You know, when I was doing my PhD, I didn't think that reading about the male body would lead me to topics such as violence against women, economic disparity, power relations, capitalism, and patriarchy. But I think this is the overarching theme guiding academia of the 21st century. It's this call to understand how different structures of socio-economic and political systems intersect to shape people's lives and lived experiences. And so when it comes to the male body, scholars have been able to identify exact moments in history that shaped what is regarded today as the ideal standard. In the past, having a muscular body for a man was considered of the earth. It was working class. It meant that the man had to sell his labor, and it stood in opposition to the upper class cultured bodies. But there was soon a shift in media narratives that began codifying the muscular body with traditional masculinity. So that includes strength, power, assertiveness, aggression, dominance, sexual prowess, and emotional stoicism. And so we can see this shift that happened to be a reaction to social changes. For example, during the US's defeat of the Vietnam War, this was in the 1970s, the US embraced the iconization of hypermuscular figures like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone as a way to remasculinize its national's global image. And this is really where we saw bodybuilding shift from being subculture, which is what it was, into mainstream status, into action toys, into leading figures, and so on. There was another study that showed that during second wave feminism and the gay liberation movement of the 1980s, the degree of muscularity in male models increased by 30%. So again, what we're observing here is the influence that politics, global warfare, gender, and social dynamics has on shaping the male identity and consequently the male body. So for my research, what I did is I examined the representation of masculinity and muscularity in various media outlets, like the one here listed on the left side. So it's print media, cinema, makeover shows, video games, sports journalism, reality TV, pornography, and yeah. So what I was able to detect is that those media products function as a form of male preserve away from feminism and class struggle. There was this repetition and the formulaic representation of the muscular body as means to restore male dominance in social hierarchy, in which muscularity was traded in for masculinity. And this is a quote I took from one of the studies that looked into reality TV shows. I think it was on Love Island. I'm not exactly sure, but I know Love Island did horribly when it came to this. So it said, white male viewers are invited to reimagine, recreating a white male utopia in which they have economic and cultural dominance. Notions of white supremacy, backlash against feminism, and the male body become ever so evident when we examine the online interaction of the Incel community. And this is what I want to talk about next. So I came across this article the other day, and it posed the question, are Incel forums the new pro-anorexia groups? Now that's a really interesting question, right? What does a community known for harboring extreme misogynistic, racist, homophobic, and transphobic sentiment have to do with the pro-eating disorder community? In order to understand how this overlaps, it would be useful to know what's the premise of their ideology. So for those who identify themselves as incels, they believe that they are incapable of forming romantic and sexual relations because of the way that they look. And this is where the preoccupation with appearance happened, with some extreme measures taken to change it. And I've listed some here in the box below. So as you can see, it includes steroids, penis stretching, wrist widening, makeup, face reconstructive surgery, viewing techniques. So it's really extensive methods here. But if you ask me, I think what's aggregating this hostility and alienation is a pressure on young males to be a real man. So there's a masculinity scholar called Kimmel, and he suggested that sexual intercourse is positioned as a rite of passage into manhood. And so a boy is not recognized as a real man until he goes through it. And until then, he's just a boy and not a real man. There is a study done in 2018, it's called Going with the Flow, and it found that many college men, college students, male college students, will agree to sexual intercourse, even though they don't want to, out of fear of being perceived as weak and not man enough. And so really our task here is to pull back these layers and see what's really going on, because there's nothing intrinsic about a boy growing up that makes them hate women. There is something in our society that's teaching them that, no? So again, what we're observing here is the positioning of sexual intercourse, of sexual relations, of female bodies and male bodies to serve as commodities, as resources for self-actualization and praxis to male hegemony and social power. And once these measures are exhausted, we observe the use of violence, and in particular, violence targeting women as an acceptable means to reconstruct that manhood. So it's a compensatory form of masculinity, if you will. So just stopping here, we're noticing some interlinks between this acute attention to the male body, misogyny, and violence against women. But there are also links to suicide and self-harm. There was a study done on the Incel community that found 74% of the members suffer from long-lasting depression and anxiety, and around 67.5% have considered suicide. That's a really big number. They pointed towards the inability in finding affordable housing, employment, feelings of isolation, and inability of accessing mental health services and amplifying those feelings. I believe this current tendency to demonize the incel community does more harm than good. It creates this phantasmagorical evil, which hinders our ability from dealing with it in reality, but also barricades us from recognizing them as 17 to 18-year-olds, young men who are going through a great deal of existential angst, caught up between society's expectations of masculinity, feelings of inadequacy and shame, and without a proper outlet, resort to these online spaces for support. And it's particular because of these feelings of material and emotional precarity that makes them vulnerable to the spread of misinformation, bad faith actors, half-truth and conspiracy theories. So we don't have anything existing right now that acts as a buffer against this, because this is what we're seeing happening online. And I'm just going to say this last thing before going to the last slide. To dismiss the incel community as being merely about sexual relations or lack of with women would be to miss the complexity of the issue at hand here. This is not just about sexual relations or achieving that perfect figure, but a deep gender role conflict, patriarchy in particular, that conditions males to tie their self-worth and selfhood to external indicators like financial success and social status and the level of independence and self-reliance. In fact, many men today are living under what Kimmel calls a system of tension, of having to constantly prove and perform their masculinity. And this pressure here is what negatively correlates to their mental health. So where do we go from here? What are some steps we can take for the future? There is within the medical field and patriarchal society at large an understanding that posits a particular nobility among men who can suffer in silence, that it's only acceptable to ask for help after reaching a considerable level of severity. So for me, the most important thing that we can do right now is to engage in the destigmatization of males from seeking help. Recognize that there's an urgent need to allocate attention and resource towards male mental health. Conduct extensive research studies such as ethnographies and semi-structured interviews, which is what we're doing right now with Anna. The reevaluation of existing tools that measure emotional disturbances among males. So it's been shown that men consistently underreport and underestimate the severity of their symptoms. Moreover, they're actively discouraged from showing them. So males are discouraged from boyhood to show emotions such as crying or admit feelings of vulnerability. In fact, admitting that there is an emotional problem is thought of to be inconsistent with masculinity. And so we really need these tools that account for this form of gender socialization and aim to understand how masculinity can mask what we've grown to consider to be traditional markers of mental health. From there, we can design specific gender-sensitive treatment. And of course, it's very important, we need to increase the access to mental health services for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jwana, for such an interesting talk, and for me, like very new concepts and really interesting. Thank you very much. So then we will go back to you for the Q&A, and so now is the turn of Rosie. Rosie, thank you very much for being with us today. I will introduce Rosie. Rosie Pendrous currently works as research fellow at the Institute of Applied Health Research at the University of Birmingham, and currently she's supporting work on the Science Study, a project which aims to explore self-harm in young people with eating disorders. Today, Rosie will talk about the exploration of psychological recovery from an eating disorder, presenting reflections from online research. Thank you very much, Rosie, and now this is your time for presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Al. I'm just going to share the screen. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to our lunchtime webinar today. So I'm currently working at UOB part-time, but I'm also a part-time PhD student and honorary research associate at the University of Chester. And as part of my honorary work, we're continuing our research program there, which we've looked at psychological recovery from an eating disorder. And we started this research in 2016, so quite a long time ago now. We've had a few studies ongoing, but I'm going to present the findings from study 1, as well as a couple of challenges and reflections that we've had as a research team on some of the challenges of doing this research. Just before I start, we do ask that slides with this Twitter symbol on are not shared, just as the research is currently under review and may be subject to change, just based on peer-reviewed comments. So eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder, as well as other eating disorders, have quite a high lifetime prevalence for the general population. I think the average estimate is about 1%, though we do see differences between different eating disorders, ranging from anywhere between 0.3% all the way to 3.5%. And eating disorders carry important clinical outcomes, especially psychological comorbidities, where people with eating disorders tend to have quite high levels of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts and behaviours, including self-harm. And one more recent meta-analysis, I think from 2018, found that I think 1/4 or up to 1/3 of people with an eating disorder have thought about suicide in their lifetime. And people with anorexia are 18 times more likely than age-matched controls to die by suicide. There is an increased risk of mortality due to physical complications such as the effects of restriction or binging and purging, as well as dying by suicide. And there's been a real challenge in the eating disorder literature on how we understand and conceptualize what recovery means for people with an eating disorder. And one systematic review found that recovery rates tend to vary depending on the specific study that's been looked at. So recovery can range anywhere between no recovery at all the way to almost guaranteed recovery for both anorexia and bulimia. Just to look at a couple of longitudinal studies to provide a bit more context. One study found that anorexia recovery can take approximately 10 years on average, with another study finding that approximately 2/3 of those with anorexia or bulimia recovered after 22 years. Historically, there's been a lack of consensus on defining recovery, and in a medical setting, it's very much focused on BMI and weight restoration, without necessarily looking beyond in terms of psychological recovery as well. More recently, this systematic review provided a really useful kind of consensus on how we could define recovery and conceptualize recovery going forward, in that it includes the physical, behavioral, and psychological cognitive domains of an eating disorder, as well as the absence of any eating disorder. And just to highlight the absence of any eating disorder, often what we see is that someone who may initially have presented with anorexia nervosa, it might be that later on it changes and might meet the criteria for a different eating disorder as well. So that's what the definition means by any eating disorder. And as a research team, we were really interested in looking at the psychological characteristics across recovery. And coming from a psychology quantitative background, we initially studied this quantitatively, but a couple of our more recent studies have really tried to look at this qualitatively as well, based on some of the challenges that we'd faced from study one. And the first challenge that we had was, how do we measure recovery quantitatively? Especially because recovery is logistically really hard to study. If recovery can last up to 22 years, that requires quite a lot of participants to begin with and following them over a really long period of time, anywhere up to 22 years, and that would require quite a lot of funding that we didn't have at the time. So what we considered doing instead was using the Anorexia Stages of Change questionnaire, which essentially allows us to compare people at different stages of recovery on various psychological characteristics. And the Anorexia Stages of Change questionnaire categorizes people essentially into one of 5 categories, ranging from pre-contemplation, where people may have no intention to seek treatment or support for their anorexia. They may not even be aware that they have an eating disorder at that time, all the way through to maintenance, where they might be maintaining their recovery goals and preventing relapse. And just to provide a little bit more context, here are a couple of example questions of the Anorexia Stages of Change questionnaire. So they do focus on a range of symptoms of anorexia, such as referring to gaining weight and fear of fatness. So they can range anywhere from, as far as I'm concerned, I do not need to gain weight, all the way to I'm working to maintain the weight gains I have made. And in relation to fear of fatness, it can range from my fear of becoming fat is not excessive, all the way to I have succeeded in reducing my fear of becoming fat and I want it to stay this way. And so our online research, and I'll present the findings of study 1 as the other 2 are ongoing, we aim to explore the psychological characteristics across these stages of recovery. And indeed actually seeing whether the ANSOC is a useful way of doing this, knowing that we've had this challenge of defining recovery. And because the Anorexia Stages of Change questionnaire focuses just on anorexia symptoms, anorexia is the focus of this study. So we had a cross-sectional online survey where we recruited participants using social media between 2017 and 2019. And we had a range of questionnaires, including our eating disorder diagnostic scale, which was based on the DSM-4 criteria for anorexia. And that also gave us a symptom severity score as well. We had depression, anxiety, stress, suicidal thoughts, self-harm and suicide attempts, as well as experiential avoidance. So our participants, we recruited anyone over 16 who had self-reported anorexia nervosa. And while we recruited 755 participants to this study over those couple of years, only 226 of our sample actually met the criteria for DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for full and subthreshold anorexia, which we thought was really interesting. I'll talk a bit about that at the end, but a quarter of our sample also had bulimia, and another quarter had no diagnosis as well. And in terms of the anorexia stages of change questionnaire, we actually found that a lot of our sample were in the contemplation stage of recovery, where they were considering accessing treatment, though they hadn't already done so at that time. And we had no participants in that latter stage of recovery, the maintenance stage, where they were already maintaining their goals. And in terms of demographics, the average age was 23 of our sample, and most of our participants were female and of white ethnicity. Most of our participants were recruited through Facebook or Reddit, so these were very much kind of specific groups relating to eating disorders. It might have been to do with eating disorder support group or recovery group. And in terms of whether they'd already accessed treatment before, most of our sample had accessed treatment before completing this study, although we slightly regret not asking a little bit more about their treatment history to get a little bit of a better idea about that. And in terms of our findings, we found significant differences between those 4 anorexia stages of change questionnaire on all of our psychological questionnaires relating to symptom severity, suicidal thoughts, depression, anxiety, stress, and avoidance. And we essentially saw an overall trend for those in those later stages of recovery having lower scores on those psychological outcomes compared to those in the earlier stages, which is what we expected to find. But of note, we found that 90% of our sample had reported lifetime self-harm. And of those who'd reported lifetime self-harm, 69% had attempted suicide in their lifetime, which we found to be really striking, especially since the meta-analysis that I reported earlier found about 25% reports of self-harm and attempted suicide. So ours were considerably higher than that study. And just to go into these a little bit more detail, so suicidal ideation, the trends look just a bit like this. So on the left, the y-axis, you can see the scores ranging from 0 to 12 on our scale. And then the dotted line is, according to this scale's validation, a score of 3 was indicative of high suicidal risk. So actually across those first 3 stages, the participants had an average score of above that clinical risk, though there were no differences between the preparation and action stages on suicidal thoughts according to our post-hoc tests. And then in terms of this outcome, the scores ranged from 0 to 21, though we found no differences specifically between pre-contemplation and the contemplation stage of recovery. And then again, no differences between preparation and the action stages, though we did find differences between, for example, pre-contemplation and the later stage action. And we see a similar trend for the remainder of the results, but in terms of this outcome, again, there were no differences between those latter stages, but actually the higher stages were still showed higher scores on this outcome compared to those later stages. However, for stress, the post-hoc test only showed a difference between contemplation and preparation. And in terms of avoidance coping, there was only a difference between pre-contemplation and preparation, sorry. So across all of the groups, there were fairly similar in terms of the mean score on this outcome. And then finally, for symptom severity, again, there were no differences between contemplation and action and preparation and action. So in summary, essentially, we do see that there's an overall trend, but for specific outcomes, there were mixed results in terms of some of those later stages. But on the whole, people in the pre-contemplation stage at the time generally had pretty high scores compared to the other stages. Before I go on, I would emphasize a little bit of caution about those findings, because we did have some reflections and key challenges that we had with the results as well. So for example, there were no participants in the maintenance stage, and most of our participants were in the contemplation stage according to the ANSOP, which really limited comparability on some of those psychological outcomes across the stages. And actually other validation studies that are more recent found similar results in terms of the anorexia stage, or at least participants recruited online being mostly in the contemplation stage and no one kind of reporting being in recovery. And I think this could be a function of a recruitment strategy where we were recruiting participants through social media who were currently accessing eating disorder support groups, where if someone is currently in that maintenance stage or recovery stage, they might not be needing to access those groups. And it also questions whether a fixed state of full recovery is possible. As we've seen in published qualitative work, that actually recovery is really challenging to meet, and actually it's more of a process than a fixed state. Another challenge is that the anorexia stages of change questionnaire doesn't consider non-linearity of recovery, where actually it's not necessarily the case that people go from the pre-contemplation stage all the way to the maintenance stage. Actually, it's very possible that over those several years that actually, relapsing slightly, and it's very possible, and it's not a linear process. Qualitative work has again found this, where treatment entails a cycle of transitions before recovery occurs. And actually recovery also includes positive constructions in sense of building hope and self-compassion, not always to do with an absence of depression, for example. This is highlighted in our data as well, where actually some of our participants in the pre-contemplation earlier stage of recovery had reported being in treatment before. So actually, even though they had some treatment, that actually they then were in that first stage of recovery according to the scale. And also one of the challenges that we had was that not everyone who took part had anorexia according to our diagnostic scale, and actually self-reported as having anorexia. There were a lot of people who had no diagnosis as well, and I think this highlights some of the challenges of using a diagnostic scale like the eating disorder diagnostic scale, where actually it might be highlighting that there are some false negatives there, that it might not capture what an eating disorder, the lived experience of an eating disorder might be. And I think it's challenging as well when we don't have an interview component as well with a clinician who knows the background of the person and in the context of their life as well. And it's also, as I mentioned earlier, eating disorder diagnosis can change over time. So we ran some exploratory analyses with the entire sample, so not just those with anorexia according to the scale. And we did find a very similar pattern of results with that overall trend. And finally, I think it highlights some further work is needed on suicidality in terms of contemporary suicide theory. So in some preliminary qualitative analyses that we've run in a later study, there was a real sense of defeat and hopelessness in terms of a treatment experience if it was particularly negative, and in terms of the length of their recovery. And defeat and entrapment are really key parts of some contemporary suicide theory, such as the integrated motivational volitional model of suicidal behaviour. So in conclusion, and I appreciate that there's a lot of challenges with using the anorexia stages of change questionnaire. It's not perfect, but as a snapshot, our findings do suggest that those with anorexia on an online community sample had really high levels of psychological comorbidity, regardless of recovery stage, particularly in terms of self-harm and suicide attempts, as these were particularly high in our sample that we found. And in terms of a few future directions, I think it would be really useful to revalidate the anorexia stages of change questionnaire and diagnostic scale in an online sample. Further work, I think, particularly qualitative, on the meaning of and arguments potentially against a full recovery. There's also the bulimia stages of change questionnaire that I haven't seen much work done in terms of those with bulimia, so I think that's a definite future direction, and maybe they could future work could replicate the type of analysis that we've done, and also more diverse research on recovery is needed as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for such an interesting talk. So thank you. So now we'll start with so we have 20 minutes for the Q&A. So we have already a few questions in the Q&A. I can see that one of the participants is raising the hand. So please leave your question in the Q&A, and then I will read it to the speakers today. So this first one is for Jwana. So hi, Dr. Aziz, very interesting talk. I was just wondering if you have ever shared your findings with members of the Incel community. Did it resonate with their own experiences?
Thanks a lot for that question. To answer it, no, I mean, I wasn't able to share my findings with the Incel community, but right now we are working on a research study that examines the experiences of the Incel community. So we're really trying to create this profile of what it's like, of the history, of the social relations of being an Incel. And hopefully that gives us a wider glimpse into the experiences of the Incel members.
Thank you, Jwana. This question is for Rosie. Hi, Rosie, nice talk. I was just wondering if you found differences in recovery domains between people who were considered threshold versus sub-threshold.
Yeah, great question. So actually, we didn't have that many people who were in the sub-threshold of our diagnostic scale for anorexia. I think there were about 70. So we didn't run extra sub-analyses just in the interests of having statistical power for our quantitative analyses. But I think that's definitely a question for future research. I know our senior eating disorder clinician, Jane, who's involved in the project, really wanted to look at that as well. And I think that's something that we'll look at in our other studies as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Now this question is from Anna Lavis, and I think maybe both of you can answer to this question or how you feel. So Anna is asking, if we draw together the two talks to reflect on experiences of eating disorders as both individual and social, does this duality shape our understandings of what recovery is or how to facilitate it?
Oh, Rosie, do you want to go first, or should?
I'm just having a reread of it, sorry.
Yeah, I'll try to answer if you'd like to. Yeah? Okay, I think, yeah, like I said in my presentation, I think we're still trying to understand what are the main drivers behind eating disorders. We still don't know what it is that constructs it. It's because it's built on a matrix of things, right? So it's biological, psychological, and environmental factors. And I just assume that the path to recovery would involve this as well. So it's not just going to be one explicit thing that's going to lead into recovery, but the matrix of these that would facilitate it. I mean, I think you would know more on recovery, Rosie.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely extend what you've already said, Jwana. I think in terms of recovery, it's really challenging because I read a paper earlier about whether a fixed state of recovery is possible, and actually it does involve all these different factors. And in some sense, there are arguments against this view of a full recovery being possible because actually there might be residual symptoms, eating disorder thoughts that prolong throughout the lifetime, and actually this idea of full recovery could be quite challenging, and it's about more having this view of recovery is possible, but it's what it means for you essentially. I don't know if I've quite answered that question.
Yeah, I think both of you have addressed very good question of Anna. I continue. We are getting more questions here in the Q&A. So this next question doesn't say to who is addressed. I think it might be for you, Jwana, but anyways, I'm raising it here. Following on from the idea that the patriarchy has at least in part shaped the lack of representation and research on eating disorders in males, to what extent has the patriarchy influenced what and how we have studied what we do know about eating disorders in males, especially ideas around masculinity, correlates and risk factors of vigorexia or eating disorders in males? Are there any disparities in findings in the research that perhaps utilizes feminist theories versus the research that does not?
Okay, it's a really interesting question. That's really an interesting question. Thank you. I mean, like I said in my talk, there are certain conditions, especially when it comes to emotional disturbances or emotional things, that are positioned as feminized. because that's because we have the duality in which that which is rational is male and that which is emotional is female. And this is where preoccupation with body concerns has been thought as feminine. And that's why we have the stigma around eating disorders when it comes to men. Just let me read, what was the second half of the question? Oh, I can't find it.
Sorry, I can't, because I just moved it to the
I
think it was, are there any disparities in findings in the research that perhaps utilizes feminist theories versus the research that does not?
Yeah, this is still a very under-researched area. Like I said in my presentation, there's only 1% of peer-reviewed journals that talk about this. So to have a conclusive answer to this is still in its preliminary stages. We still need a lot more research to have a conclusive finding on this.
Thank you very much, Jwana. Another question. Thank you to Rosie and Jwana, brilliant talks. Question for Rosie. Did you explore what previous treatments the participants had been through, which may have contributed to their lower depression, stress, anxiety scores, for example, CBT?
Great question. And unfortunately, we didn't. This was something that we really regret not having asked about. So unfortunately, we can't really derive whether the effects would have been due to CBT, for example. Though in our second study, we have begun some qualitative analyses, and someone did describe in depth their treatment experience in terms of how it's affected their recovery. And they were talking about how they've been involved with family-based therapy using the Maudsley method quite early on in their eating disorder. And I think, if I remember rightly, they went through the process a few years before taking part in our study, and they talked about how they still have flashbacks and nightmares from the treatment and how that had negatively affected their recovery. So it would be really interesting, I think, for future research to kind of look at differences between therapies as well, particularly if they're very focused on rapid weight gain. That can be quite a traumatic experience, or if they're very much around, building coping mechanisms and very focused on the psychological recovery.
Thank you, Rosie. This question is from Matthew Broom. Great talks, thanks both. Question for Jwana. Do we know how the evidence base for treatment for male eating disorders differs? For example, do the same psychological treatments work? Also, are those in Incel groups also at risk of right-wing radicalization extremism? You can see the question more.
Yes, I can see the question. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so do we know evidence-based treatment for males for eating disorder works? To be very honest, I don't know much about the recovery programs for males in particular. Maybe Rosie would know about this. But what I know is that there is a stigma in the medical field and recovery programs when it comes to male seeking help for these emotional disturbances. So I think going forward, we need to have a particular thought out gender sensitive treatment when it comes to male eating disorders. I don't think we can treat male eating disorders the same as we do with female eating disorders. The same with depression. For example, one of the markers for depression in the past was considered crying. And because males are gender socialized not to cry and not to display emotions, we could not diagnose them with depression. So I think we still need to have a lot of research on how we can conduct this evidence-based treatment. And as for the second question, are those in Incel group at risk of right-wing? Yes, of course. Actually, there are certain overlaps between misogyny, as we all know, between misogyny, racism, xenophobic sentiment, and right-wing content, which happens online. And the online community is one of those places in which that happens.
Thank you very much, Jwana. This question is for Rosie. Rosie, was factor analysis procedures involved in your investigation? And if so, how much did it influence your conclusion?
Great question again. So unfortunately, we didn't run factor analyses with this study. We were considering it, but again, we had the limitation of sample size. I think there's a general rule of thumb of needing about 10 to 20 participants per item of the anorexia stage of change questionnaire. So we would have needed at least a minimum of about, I would say 400, sorry. So I think with that, we didn't run those analyses, but in our study 3, which is a much bigger quantitative study, we are hoping to look at that in a bit more detail, because I think it will, I think it could change our conclusion, and it'd be really interesting to see if in our online sample, whether we actually find a similar factor structure with the 5 recovery stages. We're not too sure, but thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. This question is for Jwana. Hi, Jwana. Thank you for the really interesting talk. You talk about vigorexia and a desire for muscularity among men, which I think can be seen a lot in athletes. Have you seen similar research on masculinity in women, particularly in sport?
Muscularity in women. Right, so the ideal body standard for women has currently shifted, and that has a lot to do with social media. So in the previous decades, or a few years ago, the ideal body standard for women was the thin ideal, or just like extremely slim models. And today we've moved more into that fitspiration, fitness culture that was really prominent on social media. And so new research has demonstrated that, yeah, there is a drive for muscularity among women has increased because of this new fitspo, fit life, fit girl content that we're seeing on social media. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Very good. And so then to end, so we end with a question that it's raised for each of you separately. So first, well done on the presentation. Jwana, I wonder, why do you think there is that difference in research attention? Is vigorexia's inherent lower death rate responsible for this?
Should I answer now?
Yeah, so that we can make it shorter.
All right, so we know that eating disorders among female has the biggest mortality rate, right? As for males, I'm not aware of study that demonstrated the correlation between both, but I know that the suicide rates among young males is increasing. I think right now suicide is the second highest cause of death among young males, among youngs. I'm not sure if it's males. So yeah, as to answer why there's a difference in the research attention, again, I say it's because we tend to think that concerns with appearance is a feminine issue, that if I care about my body, and even men are afraid to talk about this, because they're afraid to say that, oh, I'm feeling insecure. If we're talking about emotions, no, there's still that masculine gender norm that holds us back.
Thank you very much, Jwana. Now this question is for Rosie. Well done again. When I ran my study on anorexia nerviosa and bulimia nerviosa, I found that the majority of those with bulimia nerviosa wanted to have anorexia nerviosa. That's why we moved to a transdiagnostic model. For your scale, did you do an exploratory factor analysis on the ANSO-CQ?
Again, no, we didn't do a factor analysis for in this study, but we have one planned for our in our study 3, which is a much bigger quantitative study. I think, just ask the question.
Yeah, so it's in the,
Oh yeah, found it, thank you. In our qualitative work in study 2, we did find a similar thing in terms of those with bulimia wanting to have anorexia, and actually we saw a similar thing with anorexia where there's this perception of not being ill enough to seek treatment, and actually it needing, it ending up being that they become so unwell that then they are forced into treatment. So we definitely see a similar pattern there, and it really impacts seeking help and beginning that recovery process.
Thanks a lot, Rosie. And then to end, so thank you very much for all the questions. I think it's been like a great discussion to end with with today's webinar. So I think this question can be answered by both of you or each of you as you prefer. Do you think the specific criteria for eating disorders could be difficult to apply in the case of men? Do you think it will be necessary a redefinition of the criteria? Any of you can answer this and then we can end with the webinar.
I know in the DSM-5 there was an edit made to the diagnostic criteria in terms of the removal of the criterion to do with having periods in the menstrual cycle, and that was, I think, in part to do with the increase in eating disorders to men, for men. But I'm not sure about any other criteria for men necessarily that has been included in the diagnostic criteria.
Jwana, anything to add to this?
I mean, yeah, in terms of criteria, if we're thinking of what an eating disorder is, it's this preoccupation, it's this reproduction of the daily discipline. So I think we can still expound what it is, and I think we're still investigating what it means to have an eating disorder and how to recover from it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for both of you for such an excellent talk. I think we all learn a lot about eating disorders in male and as well in women, and both genders. So thank you very much. And then as well, there were some questions about the presentation. So then this has been recorded and then that will be available on the IMH website. So in a couple of days or weeks, so then you can access to the recording to any of you who's interested in that. So thank you very much, Jwana, Rosie, as well as Stacy for organizing the webinar, and see you all next month for our next IMH webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.